Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 112, and the topic is Introducing ZSP to Support Zero Trust Initiatives. Quick reminder, if you want to support the live stream, please follow us on LinkedIn. Our guests today are Palak Chedda, Principal Cloud Architect at Brightive in the LA metro area. And the reason for this late live stream is because our other guest is Anuj Sharma, Director of Pro Identity in the Sydney, Australia area. So welcome, guys.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, awesome to
And
be here. Glad to be speaking with you both about zero standing privileges and zero trust in general. Yeah.
okay, so let's start on that very question. Zero standing privileges, Palak. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so in my personal opinion, zero standing privileges really comes down to can we give just enough access or just enough permissions for any identity, human or not, or for a short period of time and only for the duration that they need it, right? So can we bring our organization's infrastructure or kind of the IT landscape to a state where there are no standing privileges, or there is basically a very, very reduced state of risk because there are no standing privileges or permissions that are kind of being used or being assigned to the users and non-users alike or non-humans alike. Yeah.
Oh no, I forgot. I messed this up again. I'm supposed to do introductions. So, well, now that we know that zero standing privileges are, and that's what we'll be talking about, let's pivot back to introductions. Palak, since you have the stage, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and how you got here?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, Palak Chheda, I'm based out of California here for Brightive. Been in kind of identity and access management space for about, I would say, 14 years. I started as kind of consultant, hands-on keyboard implementing role-based access control and provisioning solutions for various organizations, both in public and private sector. Then I kind of switched gears a little bit, went into industry and went with one of the social media organizations as kind of a product manager, helping them build kind of their corporate IAM strategy and roadmap and thinking about, what is next and how to kind of, modernize the IAM stack and identity program at that organization. And then now more recently, I find myself at Brightive, and I'm working more on the go-to-market side, more from technical aspect, and my role kind of is working very closely with our prospects and customers alike to kind of help shape what their security and IAM program looks like for kind of modern and hybrid infrastructure. So it's been kind of a very fruitful journey, I would say. And I did not find identity. Identity definitely found me. That's one thing I always like to say. I kind of
Yeah.
stumbled into identity, not knowing what identity is. But it's been a great ride thus far, and I don't see myself working outside of identity space.
I don't think many people go to college thinking that they're going to go into identity. I think that's kind of true.
Certainly,
Um,
certainly, yes.
Anuj, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? But I'd also like to hear a little bit about Pro Identity when you're done. When you're done telling us about what your career trajectory looked like.
Thank you, Mike. And nice, similar to the story what Palak was sharing, I guess, Mike, just echoing your comment, when I went to college, I did like computer science, but then didn't know anything about identity management per se. The first project I was put on was the identity project for a US customer. And since then, it's been close to 16 years. I've been doing identity access management. Um, 10 years in Australia since 2013, where I've been working with the public sector here, so spent some time with the New South Wales government, looking after their identity and privileged access management capability. Then started Pro Identity, which is a consulting business. So we do IT consulting, focusing again on privileged access management and identity and access management space. Working again with a couple of government customers, financial customers here in Australia, and also a little bit in utilities and energy sector. And the reason I mentioned these, I think there's a lot of overlap between ZSP and zero trust with upcoming regulatory compliance requirements here in Australia, and very keen to hear the thoughts in this podcast today to see how I can benefit and how we can offer better value to the customers here. That's me, Mike.
Cool. So let's pivot back into the topic today. Um, so I did some research on Brightive. I didn't know a whole lot about it before today. One of the great things about this live stream is that I get to learn what other people are doing. So I found it quite interesting. But one thing I was sort of going back and forth on is, would you say that Brightive is a PAM solution or an IGA solution? Because it seemed like almost like a provisioning system where we're going to provision and deprovision automatically. Black?
Yeah, great question, Mike. And I think that's one question that I think I kind of ask myself a whole lot too, is like, how do we kind of differentiate ourselves, or how is this different than a typical provisioning engine, right? One thing I would say, like, I think we are, in terms of idea and principles and like the controls we help implement, we are much closer to a PAM solution than an IGA solution, right? For example, IGAs are typically more designed and geared towards kind of audit and compliance controls of, certifications and things of that nature, versus where the PAM solution kind of come into play is like, how can we elevates users access to kind of higher level privileges and permissions. And I think that's where we are more aligned, right, in that regard. Yes, there is, at the core, it is actually we are provisioning and deprovisioning entitlements and permissions, but it is in the context of, are we safeguarding and controlling kind of high risk permissions or high risk privileges within an environment, kind of often termed as privilege access, right, within an ecosystem. So we happen to kind of do it in a way where we are kind of deprovisioning access and provisioning access, and doing it more often than a typical IGA solution would for a same user, for example. But definitely, I don't see ourselves as kind of an IGA solution to that regard. And there are a lot of kind of our customer environments where we actually work well together with an IGA solution, and in the ecosystem.
True. Yeah, I don't see that there aren't the governance features, but there's a little bit of overlap with the provisioning. And Anuj, I'm curious what your thoughts are on this approach of sort of provisioning access for users, sort of, I don't want to say just in time, or maybe that is the right term, but what do you see the trends? Is this something that you see customers are really looking for that you work with?
Absolutely. So I think the traditional identity management concepts, where we just wanted to provision an account in the Active Directories, provision a single sign-on access for users. So that is still much required, but I see a lot of overlap between the workflows that are offered with the IGA or identity governance platforms that add more value in terms of, say, requesting access, where the fulfillment part can be done by the IGA solution or the provisioning side of things. But how do I request access, or how do I um, get certification of my access that I already have? So those workflows are now being baked into those IGA platforms, and that's kind of what the customers are looking for: a holistic single pane view of all access in my environment. And the other part to that is where the customers do want that PAM and IGA to be integrated well together. There's a lot of silos in various organizations, especially enterprises, where there are platforms running without talking to each other at all, literally. So that's kind of where I see, if there's an overlap between the IGA and the PAM platform, they go really well. And that, in my opinion, gives the best value. The just-in-time part, I think that, to me, there are various tools available that do that, but I think it's a concept that it's a mind shift change that's required in the organizations to kind of adopt that idea, similar to zero trust. Just adding that notch on, where I don't want to have permissions attached to my identities on the go, like birthright, for example. I want permissions to be given when they need them. So I think that shift is happening. I won't say we are there in Australia yet, but I think I definitely see customers wanting that features when we do IT implementations.
So Anu said a couple of things that I want to bounce off on, but the first thing that he said was basically having a single control plane, maybe for multiple different systems. Um, And one of the challenges that I see with PAM systems is that they improve security because they take a system that might have been a one-off, and they make it into, they take a number of systems that were one-offs and give you one sort of control plane for them. I saw integrations for the cloud providers like Amazon, Google, Oracle, Azure, I guess. But what are sort of the limitations? What are some of the limitations? Like, how many systems could you actually integrate with a system like Brightive?
Yeah, awesome. A great question. And one of the motivation for like our founders to really start Brightive was, kind of this world moving into the cloud, and then there is going to be a state which still is, right, of hybrid environments between kind of that Active Directory driven access and controls and systems talking to Active Directory versus now the adoption of the cloud. Right. So with Brightive and the systems like that, the idea that we always kind of harped upon is that can we give the user the access that they need, regardless of how that access is given in the end system, right? Meaning, AWS identifies certain roles and permissions differently than how Azure would see kind of granular access given to a user, or how a Kubernetes cluster kind of sees how an access can be granted, right? So the Brighter platform at the very core was designed with the idea of that, regardless of what end system or how these systems kind of interact and uh, see that access is being granted to the user. How can we kind of meet the requirement of that platform and enable kind of that zero standing privileges or just-in-time access provisioning, right? So our platform has always been the idea of like we don't necessarily need to synchronize Active Directory group memberships everywhere, right? How can we get to like more granular direct platform based access? And I think AWS really took it next level when they introduced role assumptions and the idea of like not having to need like standing access and standing user accounts, right? So think of Brightive as kind of extending that idea and operationalizing it across your infrastructure, whether it is on-premise, hybrid infrastructure, or even in the cloud, right? How can we give the users only the access that they need and when they need it? And in some cases, also extend it beyond just cloud native and cloud services and go into like servers and databases and things of that nature too.
Anush, if we just limit ourselves to cloud,
Yeah.
what are some of the challenges you see customers facing with these cloud platforms, which have gotten very complex?
Yeah, no, spot on, Mike. I think I was just thinking through when Palak was talking about the hybrid environments. I think traditionally when we used to have things on-prem, it was much simpler to do identity. But as most customers, if not, they have two plus cloud vendors, cloud service providers involved, AWS, Azure, and you name it. Like there's plenty going around, and then you multiply them with the number of roles people want to be created there. It just becomes exponential when you have to do an implementation. The other challenge which I see a lot is those role compositions. So we could have access packages which or entitlements that club in those roles that a user could request, for example, but then nobody goes and checks those roles again. Like it's the project finishes and they just stick around forever, which is not good because there could be excessive role permissions which are getting provisioned. Even having those entitlements in place, it's just an ongoing challenge that I see even with existing implementations. With cloud, I think just the way again, the thought process of provisioning into cloud entitlements, not having a view. If I ask a customer today what all permissions your user have, they won't be able to tell across all different cloud platforms. So that's a major gap that gets noticed and gets asked. And I'm keen to hear, like, as platforms like Bright, if they can connect to multiple cloud providers, is there a consolidated view that it can present to a customer? That would be a game changer in my mind. That functionality.
I'll just let Palaka, you want to respond to that, or I
Yeah.
have a follow-up question after.
Yeah. I can respond real quick. Simple answer is yes. And I think that's
Okay.
where we've always talked about how Brightwave is able to understand the cloud permissions and cloud infrastructure better than kind of legacy IGA solutions per se, right? And then with every cloud, there is a notion of what I like to call as two-dimensional access, meaning it's not only about the roles and the permissions, but also at what level or which part of the kind of the cloud infrastructure is that permission applied to, right? So, for example, in AWS, it could be a specific AWS account, that is used as a staging or a development environment. Or in case of Google, it could be a specific folder or a project, right? So there is that hierarchy that exists within those cloud platforms and systems, which I think some of the legacy IAM players had kind of failed to understand the value of, or understand kind of how that implies to kind of the access and access controller, right? And that's where I think we help kind of bridge that gap and work in unison or complementing nature with the IGA platforms. And that I think a lot of customers on our end have gotten a lot of value out of, not only from visibility standpoint, but also from control standpoint, right? Because they are getting enough alerts and visibility alerts from things like Orca and Wiz, but how can you kind of get control, right? How can you kind of reduce that standing access and privileges? And that's what I think we've been make a good impact on kind of reducing that risk.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question. So Amazon IAM rules are notoriously complex, um, and it's powerful, but it's very complex. Um, and the number the you can actually use context and not just identity-based information in your policies in Amazon. But I'm
Correct.
just curious if you could reflect on some of the challenges of maybe mapping, let's say, your zero standing privileges to this new Amazon, IAM rules in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I would kind of maybe going in a little bit deeper, right? The way the kind of brighter platform is designed is in a way where you still kind of establish those roles and policies in AWS, for example, right? Or you're defining those granular roles within, say, Azure, for example, custom roles and things of that nature. And
Hmm.
Brightwave kind of helps enforce the membership of those roles and permissions, right? We will give you, yes, the visibility and the granularity of the individual policy constraints and the effect of each policy for visibility purposes as you defined, and kind of align those roles with the users that could have them. But then Brightwave kind of operationalizes both the assignment as well as kind of the provisioning and the deprovisioning of those roles and policies, right? So Brightwave doesn't take away necessarily the power of AWS and defining those policy at that granular level, but kind of helps kind of bridge the gap of defining that granularity and kind of making it available for the right use at the right period of time to the users, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Um, I'm going to leave you in the hot seat for 1 second and pivot into a slightly different or related topic. But so it sounds like we're really mapping. So we have rules in Amazon, and we have users in our enterprise, and we're creating some way to create a mapping between how do we enable these users, how do we give the user the right properties to give them these capabilities in the cloud platform. Um, but how do you actually express those policies? It's easier said than done. So now we're not expressing the policies in Amazon, but we're expressing the policies in Brightwave. How do we actually express those policies? And have you thought about adopting some standard policy syntaxes? Like maybe you could use Cedar policy syntax in Brightwave, or if not, what does your policy syntax look like?
Yeah, so we do have our proprietary policy syntax. As the product kind of started taking shape, there wasn't a good common language that could apply to kind of all pieces of infrastructure. There are things like OPA and such now. But again, going back to kind of enterprise infrastructure and kind of the state of the IAM platforms at the time, or the IAM programs at the time, we were trying to kind of marry, how can we marry that aspect with kind of this new way of doing cloud access, right? Or kind of this ephemerality nature of the cloud infrastructure itself. So we have our own policy language that can be kind of managed through code, right? So everything that we do within Brightwave's ecosystem is part of your infrastructure as a code platform and program. So as kind of you're taking your infrastructure is taking shape, your policies are taking shape, and along with that, your IAM component of kind of tying those roles and permissions and privileges to the right part of your organization with the right policies is kind of taking shape together. So we make our kind of policy language one common across, your infrastructure, but also easily kind of discoverable and deployable as part of your kind of code deployment and your pipelines.
Anush, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how enterprises are handling policy management. Like, there's a requirement to audit policies and um, to really understand them. And are you seeing any trends in policy management in the enterprises, or any challenges in that area?
So now that's a really good question, Mike. I think with policies, there's a little bit of a gap where there is this purist view of policy management where you want to do everything with the common frameworks, but when you get to the ground level, the implementations, because of the technical challenges with various uh, tech stacks that are available, I think it gets a bit messy to have that common policies across the ecosystem of a customer. So I think that's where I feel we need some sort of a middleware that can translate those rules, and we can have a common framework. That's something I'm very interested in myself. I have not seen a good implementation where there could be policies which are well managed across, not granular at least. There'll be coarse-grained permissions and policies that are applied across. Um, but I think definitely there is a bit of that challenge, like you said, this AWS complexities where it is very useful when you're in the AWS ecosystem, but once you move out and you want to manage it from another platform, that's when you kind of are reliant on reusing either those or recreating those mappings. So it's a lot of duplication that happens at times, which is not ideal. And having a view of what permissions do get, what entitlements do get provisions to those AWS and Azure, it's hard to know. And yeah, that's where I see the biggest challenge that I have been facing lately.
Do you see customers struggling with this issue of trying to consolidate, like, what are all of our policies and how do we review them?
I feel even before going to that level, the challenges which I'm seeing day to day in Australia, especially with
Mhm.
customers, are just doing the basics right. So just doing the identity management in terms of joiner mover levers, that kind of a flow, and then having those workflows on top. I think the maturity is there in some customers here, but it's not there. I would say where I would confidently say, yep, they are at a point where they can look at holistic policies across the enterprise. That's yeah. Unfortunately, I've not seen that.
Yeah, it's still a moving target. Okay, I wanted to pivot to a slightly different topic. In reading and listening to the Bright of some of the webinars or the videos, one thing that was mentioned is that Bright have really helped you, like, solve these challenges more quickly. Um, and I'm curious why that is, because the complexity of the problem is the same. Um, and there's never any easy solutions in enterprise. But I'm wondering, what is it about Brightive that actually enables more more speed in solving these challenges?
Yeah, good question. Definitely kind of, I would say loaded question, but I'll try to answer various components where we think like we kind
Yeah.
of help bring some energy in terms of kind of really getting control on access and kind of focusing on cloud access, right? One, we are a complete SaaS solution, so we are built in kind of this modern SaaS delivery platform idea, right?
Hmm.
So just getting started with Brightive and getting it deployed or connected to your cloud infrastructure is the time from 0 to 1 is very, very low. And we have a
Yeah.
lot of automations and a lot of kind of canned integration directly available to connect to any kind of cloud infrastructure, right? So for us, kind of just getting up and running and getting things kind of seeing value out of Brightive is that time is very, very much diminished. And then also us being the SaaS platform and architected in this modern way. We are API first with a lot of SDK and our CLI available, right? So a lot of these extra tooling that is available to our customers that can kind of help plug in Brighter at various aspects of their pipeline. I alluded to this a little bit earlier. The Brighter, the sometimes I've seen this in the past, even like the infrastructure is there, but people who actually requested that infrastructure to be created don't have access to it for another 2 days, right? So where that's where kind of even the brightest pipeline and our approach of kind of infrastructure as a code and kind of how brighter policies can plug into your infrastructure pipelines kind of help kind of like reduce that time frame also, right? So there are various avenues where brighter we've tried to make life easy not only for kind of the security or the IAM practitioners, but also the end users of or your stakeholders kind of using the platform, right? There is always this idea of like I am not slowing down the development or I am not slowing down the organization. So that is always kind of one piece of like uh, I would say motivation for us to always do better than what we all have experienced in the past. And so, yeah, those are, I would say, some of the examples where we've been able to kind of not only talk about it, but also demonstrate in our customer environments where, going from 0 to 1 or even from 1 to 2 has been fairly straightforward and quite simplified, right, for customers to adopt Brightive and scale.
Yeah. Anush, do you have any thoughts on what are the challenges that customers are facing with regard to the speed of their deployments? Like, do you see the velocity of these deployments as a real challenge, and an area where we can improve?
So I think with the SaaS platforms coming, in the market, various SaaS platforms are available, and most on-premise vendors do have a SaaS offering for IGAs and PAM. I think the initial deployment time is less. That what I've been seeing in various engagements that we are doing here, but it's the adoption and rolling that out across the enterprise. That's the challenge still. So we may have cut down on spinning up those servers to run the software that's required to do the job, but once you try to roll out a PAM solution, for example, there's a lot of resistance to change, because you have to the engineers in that organization will have to adopt the new ways of working most of the time. If not, it's not the same what they used to do. So I think that's the key piece that with adoption. Identity governance, I feel it's a bit less intrusive that way, but it still has that challenge where once you roll out a IGA platform, there's a lot of touch points that the platform will go to, starting with the authoritative source in HR to all the downstream systems, the cloud systems, and so forth. So the scale is bigger. So the challenge there is more around the scale of implementation, but PAM, the adoption part, is the biggest challenge. And there are things like we are trying to do at Pro Identity to kind of help ease with that, having customers on that journey where they could adopt the PAM platforms quicker. But I still feel that there's a bit more work required in that space across. So to make it a little bit less cumbersome for customers to adopt it. The last bit to that is the executive buy-in. So all these programs that work with
I was just going to say
IGA.
that actually. I was actually in our last live stream we talked about executive buy-in, and I think that matters so much in the like how fast it gets done. So I'm sorry, go ahead. Okay, you were
No,
saying.
no, that's that. I can't echo that more, Mike. I think that's one challenge which is across the board with any big program, but with IGA and PAM, we see every day where there is compliance pressures, but then unless you have that buy-in, it's carrot and a stick kind of that analogy. But I think it's still you can't push it that far enough unless there is a culture shift and the buy-in from the execs to support that program. So yeah, that's a key in my mind.
Yeah, it's not 100% a tech problem. There's also a sort of a people challenge in getting everyone on board. And yeah, and without executive leadership, it's not going to happen fast.
Yeah,
Um,
very nicely put, actually, Mike. If I may, like, kind of just like speak to one of the points that Anuj made, right? Is like especially for the PAM solutions or even any kind of like just-in-time access, right? Like the users are interacting with the platform a lot more than they would interact with an IGA solution, for example, right? More or less, the IGA platform is doing its job, nightly batch runs or things like that. So one of the things that we always try to do is kind of meet the users where they are, right? So we have like full featured, CLI that can do both end users and the administrative task and take a lot of that away. We have direct integration with all the major cloud platforms and their CLIs, right? So kind of interacting with AWS CLI is a breeze, and you're not having to kind of copy paste credentials from one place or going to browser back and forth to get something and copy paste in the command line, things of that nature. So, and we are continuously kind of improving and making amendments to those things, because at the end of the day, if the users are not satisfied with the PAM solution, they are going to find shortcuts for themselves, right? And that is more and more prevalent in kind of the cloud era and the cloud infrastructure. So in fact, we've had a lot of good feedback around the way we approach this and how we approach kind of the usability aspect of things. And we've been able to kind of at least in my opinion, kind of made very kind of industry first kind of type of integrations and things that and make it available at an enterprise scale.
Yeah, if you fail, credential sharing happens. Um,
Exactly, right? Yes.
um, so we're so one of the blogs that I was reading mentioned something that I thought was really interesting, and it was talking about the shifting the model from focusing on identity to one directly managing the authorizations associated with these identities. And I've had a theme lately in my LinkedIn blogs about moving to capabilities-based access control instead of
Mhm.
identity-centric access control. Um, but I'm not sure if that's actually was just something how important that was, to the story of Brightive. But I just wanted to poke on that a little bit because I'm personally very interested in that topic.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll definitely share my thoughts on it. And I'm sure like our founders have probably thought through this way more than I have been able to now, or at least comprehend it. As kind of like Brightive was taking shape, right? Brightive started kind of the cloud first, and then we started, inwards, or then we looked inwards, versus a lot of the other legacy players that kind of started for on-premise infrastructure and that legacy PAM solutions and things like that, and now they support cloud, right? So our worldview was very, very different. We kind of looked like outside in versus inside out type of story. So when we talked about kind of, or when we even talk about now, is access and permissions. The way kind of legacy PAM has always worked is around like, okay, if I get access to these credentials and all these credentials that have higher level privileges across my infrastructure that is within my premises, then I have good control, right? Whereas that thing doesn't replicate very well for cloud infrastructure and infrastructure that is very, very ephemeral in nature in itself, right? So the idea really is that, okay, then how can we control, what Palak needs today versus what he might need tomorrow, and do it at a permission level, right? So the idea really stems from that, is like, we can't necessarily vault Palak's account in every cloud platform, right? Or we can't really go that granular if we started vaulting every user account or every role and permission that somebody can have in the cloud. Then how can we kind of facilitate these modern use cases and access to modern infrastructure? And that's where the idea of kind of really kind of, why don't we take a kind of shift to permission based model, where the permissions are the crown jewels, or the that carry the most risk, and how can we kind of bring that back down, right? So if your infrastructure doesn't need to have thousands of role assignments at a time, can we bring it to the kind of least common denominator, and then level up the user as and when they need access or permissions, right? And then being able to do that with granular permission control. So I think, yeah, that was just the idea of like, just vaulting doesn't help, and vaulting kind of these being like the proxy accounts or things like that that allow you to impersonate an account, it doesn't kind of scale very well and work well in the cloud infrastructure, right? So how can we kind of still provide similar controls but do it in kind of cloud friendly way?
Yeah. Anush, I'll phrase this question a little bit differently for you, but so traditionally we've looked at roles, traditional governance systems. We define enterprise roles, and then we map those to capabilities. Um, are you starting to see are the limitations in this model? Do you think maybe it's time for us to maybe evolve into something different?
Yeah,
It's a very
so
esoteric question. I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot. Feel
no,
free
it
to
is a,
answer.
it's, it is a good question, and the challenge with role management with the scales at which enterprises are operating, I think we have touched on a few times in the podcast already, where we are seeing a lot of, I mean, they get multiply and exponentially increase in the organization just because we have so many cloud providers, we have so many systems that we are managing. Traditionally, we used to have a handful in our IGA platform, but that's not the case anymore. The other part to that is the complexity in those role combinations. So there could be, I mean, those segregation of duties and things like that, which are required from our IGA platform to implement or enforce. There could be combination of roles which have been there for a while, which shouldn't have been. So they could be those combinations which don't get reviewed. So that's the other challenge, just because of the scale, and it causes a lot of fatigue to the managers who get those certification requests
Hmm.
to see what those role combinations are. Half of them don't make sense because they are spelled in tech speak rather than business speak. So I think that's the other challenge. So having those
Yeah.
um, messaging that goes with those certifications, that this is what you're approving, and most of the time, if not, they don't have time and they just might click approve, and that's
It's
the
not the
hiccup.
most fun thing you have to do as a manager, to review
No.
your reports roles and approve them. Um,
No, and
yeah, I guess what
the
I'm asking though is that, so Palak said, we're going to let you define policies that map to capabilities at the cloud providers. And traditionally, we've had roles. Um, but it seems challenging. Um, what are the challenges of is our roles enough for us to figure out if you should be able to update an S3 bucket? Like what are the challenges we have, and is in are these mappings and the policies we need to make? What's the information we need in order to be able to figure out what those policies should be?
So I think there's a bit of yeah, just the role is not enough, absolutely, and there could be instances where we don't want even a person who has that role to make that update or a change in that system for various reasons. So having that enforcement point away from just getting access to a role, I think that's another layer of security that's required, especially with the cloud providers, and having policy-based controls, I think, is the way forward. Um, um, how do we embed that into our IGA platform or overall system? That's a challenge because again, with this various vendors in the play, it's hard to find that common language that can apply across as a broad brush. Yeah, I hear you, Mike. I think I wish I had the right answer for that. I have not seen that
Yeah,
implemented yet. So, but just one more thought which comes from what Palak was mentioning. There are two approaches I'm seeing with just with the zero trust and zero standing privileges is
that's where I
having
wanted
those
to go next. So thank you.
Ah,
Yeah.
it's already your mind. With vaulted credentials, so I see a lot of solutions that are being used by customers where people have access to some vaulted credentials, and that's how they access the system, and they lose access to that vaulted credentials once they have done their work, or they elevate their own access. In my mind, zero standing is more elevating your own account's access. But keen to hear the thoughts. And sorry, Mike, if I stole your question. But yeah,
No, I just wanted to pivot this to zero trust because it's in the title of the episode, and I feel like we wouldn't have done
yes.
our jobs if we didn't trust. If we didn't, so thank you. No, go on. Yeah. So, Palak, maybe
No, I think
did you finish your question, Anuj? Actually,
Yeah, so just keen to see what the thoughts are in the room, like what you are seeing in the US, and is that a similar approach that, or it's a mixed bag where some customers are still engaging with that vaulted credential path, or is there a common understanding of zero standing where we want to elevate
yeah,
the identity's access?
yeah. I mean, I think it's been almost like kind of an aha moment in the market, is my point of view, in the last 6 months or so, where we are kind of seeing the eagerness from our customers and prospects around zero standing privileges, and kind of like you mentioned, elevate that user's own accounts, or to higher level of permissions, rather than being able to kind of impersonate a vaulted credential, right? So there is definitely more awareness than what I was used to even when joining Brightive. And it was kind of a foreign language at the time, almost, right, when we talked about how can you just elevate your everyday account to do more things, right, with the right policy framework or the right approval or the re-authentication and verification before we allow you to do that, and to now actually folks asking for something like that. So there is definitely a shift happening, in my opinion. There are more and more prospects and customers we talk to are eager to not only learn more, but also see how it will take shape within their organization and what their journey would look like. And really kind of go down to kind of the cloud specifics. Like, it's very hard to do that or have that model in cloud, right? What are you really going to vault when when you need access to a specific S3 bucket once a week, right? So how many user accounts are you going to create in AWS Identity Center, or same thing in Azure? And how many Azure licenses are you going to pay for those, user accounts? And that's where you kind of end up with coarse grain access, and access with kind of lot of domain administrators, with not really them that many domain administrators needing those permissions all the time. So I think, yeah, definitely there is, I think, a lot more awareness than what it used to be, and a lot of organizations are kind of starting to at least warm up to the idea of zero standing privileges, and kind of making that possible across their infrastructure, whether it is kind of that AD backed organization or not, right? So yeah, there's definitely a shift happening,
Hmm.
to summarize.
I feel like we didn't quite do our jobs because we didn't tackle zero trust, but I don't feel like we can really do it justice. So um, there's always the LinkedIn page for discussion afterwards. Um, but I think we should go to last thoughts. Um, and Anush, why don't we start with you? Last thoughts before we close?
A really interesting conversation, and thanks, Mike, for arranging this. I think um, my takeaway is that it's a shift that's happening across, and there's a lot of work that will go into, I guess, maturing the customer's journeys to reach that zero standing privilege concept. So yeah, I'm keen and I'm all in for that, and I want to see improvements across, I guess, and keen to keep in touch as well, I guess, with Brightive to see how the landscape is changing in the US, and how things are here. We do have a lot of compliance requirements with the security of critical infrastructure and so forth here in Australia, which are enforcing customers to think about zero trust and zero standing privileges. And I see a lot of potential in terms of customers improving their security posture, helping them become resilient to cyber attacks and so forth. So I think it was a really good discussion. I really enjoyed it so far. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Palak, last thoughts since you proposed the
Um,
episode?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Mike, for arranging this. Thank you for reaching out to me to kind of have this conversation in the first place. I love this concept of office hours, and would love to kind of come back and maybe speak with you and other participants in the office hour as well. I'm excited to kind of just be at Brightive and the just juncture of this industry where we are at with regards to zero standing privileges. Our data on the back end keeps showing that there is a lot more interest. So, we are definitely staying busy and will continue to stay busy, I think, for coming years. Um, Brighter will also be at Identiverse next week, and I'll be there too in person. So anybody listening to this podcast before Identiverse, please come stop by at the Brighter booth at Identiverse in Las Vegas. And hope to kind of speak with a lot of you and in the near future. Thank you,
Oh,
Mike.
um, so next episode is we're going back to MOSIP. I think this is the third MOSIP episode. MOSIP is a platform for really for identity, for issuing credentials in emerging sort of nations. They're doing some really innovative work in the verifiable credential space. I think they probably have the most advanced verifiable credentials platform right now, open source. So I'm looking forward to that episode. I will also be at Identiverse, since Palak mentioned that. So we're off next week. We'll have an episode on Thursday, Mosop, but next week we're off. I'll be at Identiverse. I'm giving a presentation with Alex Olivier, another former Identirati guest, the CTO of Cerbos, one of the pioneers in embeddable PDPs, and we're talking about embeddable PDPs. The last session before the end of the conference next week. So anyway, it should be fun. Identiverse is always fun. And with that, I will thank the audience, thank the guests, and we'll see you next time.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Mike.
Bye.
Thank you for having this.